First of all, good morning. Welcome to Westbridge Church. My name is Jeremiah. I'm one of the pastors here, and it's awesome to have you with us. I want to say hello to everybody joining us online. If you're a parent viewing room, that's a great option if you have small kids you prefer to keep with you during the service, and hello to everybody joining us in our cafe. This update is, last year, we partnered with Compassion International and said we want to build a church in this community. Oftentimes, churches will go together because it's a pretty significant cost. It's about $75,000. And then after everything came in and some of the landslides and problems, they said we need to kick in a little bit more. So the whole construction cost came out to about $94,000. And typically, like a lot of churches will go in with other churches and try to fund that. Westbridge, as a church, we were able to fund 100% of that just because of your generosity. And so that's just an awesome thing. And the cool thing is, as the church, we expect the church to be finished with construction in the next, through the summer here. And then we'll have the opportunity to add them to our list of global partners and partner with kids in that community, sponsor kids in that community. We'll have the opportunity to take trips to see the church that was built, to see some of the kids that people from Westbridge Church are sponsoring. Such a cool partnership. So thanks for your generosity. It's just because of your generosity that we're able to say yes to those kinds of things all around the world. And we do that all the time, and it's because so many of you are so generous with what God has entrusted to you. So thank you, thank you, thank you. The other thing, real quick, before we jump in, 2 weeks from today, we're doing a worship night water baptism. So if you have questions about water baptism and you want to have some of those answered, we have a FAQ page on our website. Go check that out. Email me, email a staff member, call the church, send out a page, write a letter, send a carrier pigeon, whatever you need to do, we are available. We want to answer any questions that you have, but Jesus was baptized in water, and then he encouraged us to follow his example, and the whole point of baptism is this, that because of Jesus, because of his grace, because of what he's done, I can be made new. And the old me is buried. That's why people put people down into the water. It's a symbolic burial. It's a death and burial of the old me. And then just as Jesus rose to new life, we rise to new life because of him. And nobody celebrates that like a bunch of people from Westbridge Church who have already experienced the grace of Jesus. And so we're going to do a whole night of just music, the music you heard here this morning, music, communion, and baptisms. That's the whole agenda for the whole night. And so that's 2 weeks from today, April 28th. We're going to meet right here at 6 o'clock in the evening. And so make plans for that. And if you haven't been baptized, I'd encourage you to take that next step as you continue to follow Jesus. Now, last week we kicked off a series called The Road Less Stupid. It is probably one of my favorite titles that we've ever done. This series is all about practical wisdom for everyday living because last week we did this little mass confessional and we all acknowledged that at least at some point in our lives, we don't always know what's best for ourselves. Isn't that correct? Every one of us knows that we have moments or opportunities or seasons that we wish we could go back and we wish we could undo or unsay or unspend or unaccept the invitation, relive that moment, relive that season. And since we can't go back in time, the good news is we can put wisdom into practice moving forward. And if we're going to have an honest conversation about wisdom, then I think we have to acknowledge what Solomon wrote. Solomon was a guy who had an incredible gift of wisdom from God. And he wrote this nearly 3,000 years ago. And this is really kind of a key verse for us through this whole series. It's kind of the through line. It's the foundation that helps us understand truly how to get wisdom for the different areas of our lives. Solomon would write this: "Fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom." Fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. In other words, if you're ever going to acquire wisdom, if you're ever going to be able to put wisdom into practice in your life, the starting point for it is a level of humility that acknowledges God is God and I'm not. And if there is an author of life, it would make sense to submit my life to the author of life. That if there is a creator, it would make sense to submit my life to the one who created me. That is wisdom. And so today, as we continue our series, we're going to look at practical wisdom as it relates to marriage. Now, let me say this right on the front end. If you're single, or if you're single again, don't tune out. And here's why, okay? This topic is not intended to diminish any of you who are single. In fact, when you look through the scriptures, God worked in incredible ways through all kinds of single people. Right? You look at the Apostle Paul, he was single. The prophet Jeremiah was single. John the Baptist was single. Jesus was single. Okay? And every 3 or 4 weeks, Taylor Swift is single. So, Cheap shot, I know. Okay, but here's the deal. We're gonna look at marriage, and this is not meant to diminish single in any way. There's nothing wrong with being single, and being married doesn't complete you. So if you're single, you are already complete, you are already whole, you don't need another person to complete you. You find that in God, okay? So putting that on a spouse, your happiness, your wholeness, your completion, that is not a spouse task, that is a God task. So you are good. Now, there's a bunch of people who are married. And for those who are married, we want to help you because there's some unique challenges and some things that you face as it relates to being married. You're in the process of learning to navigate, and today we want to give you some wisdom that comes from God on how to navigate marriage relationships. But let me say this. Some of you, this is going to be a refresher. Some of you are like, man, the engine, it's running good. I just need a little tune-up. That's great. Some of you, you're like, we've been married for 30 years. This is just reminders. This is a refresher course. Awesome. Others of you, you're in a season where you go, dude, we're hanging on by a thread. And I just don't know where we go from here. And I'm begging you, if you've gotten to the point in your marriage where you're tuning out, I'm begging you to tune back in. I'm begging you to just take a little bit from today and start to put things into practice a little bit at a time, because here's what I know, and we talked about this last week, God is way more concerned with your future than he is with your past. And God does not work with what should have been, God works with what is. So wherever you find yourself today, you can begin to put some of these things in practice and help as you move forward. And here's what's amazing, here's why this is so important. We really do misunderstand God's purpose for marriage. We start out, right, dating someone, and then we get married, and then the days turn into months, and the months turn into years, and the years turn into decades. And my wife and I have 2.5 decades under our belt, so we will celebrate 25 years being married this summer. And here's what I can tell you. Yeah, thanks. Here's what I can tell you. If you're not careful, it can be easy to go from thrive to survive. It can be very easy to just get into survival mode. And in the first century, the Apostle Paul is writing to a group of people in the first century. And he's writing to them about marriage. And he actually talks about a verse from the creation narrative. He pulls from the creation narrative, something that was written. And it's also a verse that Jesus himself quoted when he talked about marriage. And then Paul not only quotes that verse, repeating Jesus, repeating the creation narrative, but then he gives context to it. And here's what he writes about marriage. He says this, the scriptures say, and then he quotes from Genesis, a man leaves his father and mother and is joined to his wife, and the two are united into one. He goes, now this is what this looks like. This is why marriage is important. There's this context to it. The two actually become one. This is why in marriage you don't try to win conflicts. You don't try to win arguments, because when you win, you lose because you're one. And so you go, no. It's about solving the conflict. It's not about winning the argument or winning the fight, because you're one. The two have become one. And then here's what Paul says. He adds context. So first he quotes the verse. Now this is the Apostle Paul adding his own context. He says, this is a great mystery. Yes, it is. If you are married, you're like, that is a great mystery. Marriage is a great mystery. My spouse is a great mystery. But it is an illustration of the way Christ and the church are one. So here's what the Apostle Paul says. At some point, it's like there's this relationship in your life. It's the closest thing on a human level. It's the deepest, most intimate relationship that you can experience with another human being. And so it's this reminder of the way Christ and the church are one, that someday there's going to be this marriage between Christ and his bride. The church, the New Testament writers, those who wrote after Jesus, and those who wrote letters to churches and individuals, those who wrote sort of historical narrative and the life and teachings of Jesus, they refer to the church as the bride of Christ. Meaning that there's going to be this, like, where the bride is fully integrated, where Christ and the church become one. And in the meantime, marriage is a human construct that helps us, while we live here on planet Earth, to understand how that's going to look someday. And that's why Paul says, again, in these verses, that Christ loves the church responds. There's this union where the two become one, and it's this great mystery, but it's this daily illustration, it's this daily reminder of the way Christ and the church eventually become one. Now that's a profound. And the problem for us as we get married and we get into a marriage relationship, and what was once delightfully surprising is now painfully annoying as the years go on, right? I've done a lot of weddings in the last 20 years, and every wedding I've done, every couple and every marriage, every single couple that I've ever, officiated their wedding, every single person was like, genuinely believes, and rightly so, that our marriage is going to go the distance, it's going to be forever, nothing will ever come between us. Nobody goes into marriage thinking, man, I hope we can just hang in here for a few years and get out of this with a dining room set. You don't find that in marriage? Every single one of us, we want to be that couple that held on to the end, right? We want to be in our 90s, hanging out at the nursing home together, going to dinner at 3:30 in the afternoon, taking hits off of each other's oxygen tank, you know? And the first day of marriage starts out with really big smiles and even bigger promises. And then here's what happens. After the ceremony, we spend the next 50 years trying to keep the promises we made in the first 30 seconds. That's really difficult to do. That's why the Apostle Paul would also write this in the first century. He says, however, those who get married at this time will have troubles, and I am trying to spare you those problems. That is not a verse that gets read very often at weddings. There's no Hallmark card that you give to somebody. Congrats, brace yourself. It's gonna suck. And yet, let's be honest, having a thriving marriage year in and year out is a really difficult thing to do. And if you're married, you know this is true. Anyone who has been married for more than a couple of years can tell you this is not easy to do. It's difficult to stay close to someone over the course of many years. And the reason why, maybe we've never even put it in these terms before, but here's one of the biggest threats to every relationship. And it's not what you might think. And maybe you even know this sort of counterintuitively, and it's just like, but I've never really put it in these words. There's big things that blow up marriages. But for most marriages, the big thing that really is the greatest danger and the greatest threat to your marriage relationship isn't infidelity or financial pressure or abuse or dishonesty or malicious behavior or being married to a Bears fan. The greatest threat is this: drift. It's just drift. It's just slowly over time moving in different directions. That's the biggest threat to most marriage relationships. Drift is what happens when the stress of life and the busyness and the daily routines slowly carry us in different directions. And drift is what causes our relationships to get off course. It's what happens when we're not paying attention and when we stop being intentional about the relationship. And the reason drift is so dangerous is we rarely notice it until it's too late. About 3 summers ago, we bought a little old used motorboat. And we're just this family, like we don't go fishing. We just literally go to one lake. We go to the same lake every time, and we throw a tube in the water and we tube. That's our jam. And we go to BB Lake every time, and almost every time, this is what will happen. We'll get out there before we start tubing. It's like, man, it's hot, summer day. We go out on BB Lake, go out in the middle. Everybody puts life jackets on. As soon as we can, we jump into the water and we just swim in the middle of the lake. And inevitably, here's what happens. After about 5 minutes, somebody goes, "Where's the boat?" You're like, oh, there it is. Halfway across the lake, someone's got to power swim over to that thing, it's 300 yards away, and drag it back over, or, start it up again and bring it back around. Forgot to set the anchor. And this is what happens. It required zero effort for that boat. That boat did nothing. It just drifted. Because here's what happens. Drift requires zero effort. It's just what happens. If you do nothing at all, relationships don't stay static. If you do nothing at all, relationships drift. You've got to be intentional. They start to deteriorate. They drift because drift requires absolutely no effort. When it comes to our relationships, it's very easy for the stress of life and the responsibilities that we have on a daily basis and the routines that we go through to keep us so busy that we neglect our relationships. And we end up drifting in different directions from each other. And because it's so difficult to recognize when it's happening, it can lead to devastating consequences. Here's why. Because the longer you drift, the further you separate. Right? The longer the boat moves away from us before somebody says, "Where's the boat?" The farther away it is, and the harder it is to catch it and go after it, right? And the same thing is true in relationships. That the longer that you drift without noticing it, the further you separate from each other, and the more work it takes to start moving in the same direction again. And ultimately, isn't that what we want? We want to be moving in the same direction with our spouse. We want to feel that we're connected to them, not drifting away from each other, but closely connected. We want to feel fully accepted and fully loved and fully valued by the person we're married to. Now, here's the good news. No matter where you find yourself today, you can start today. No matter where you find yourself, even if you're like, we're hanging on by a thread, you can start today. You can start to put some of these things into practice today, and it won't change overnight. And my guess is it didn't take you, it took you more than a month to get to the place that you're at, so it might take more than a month to climb out. But if you start today, you will be amazed at how quickly you can reunite if you'll be committed to some of these things. And today, what I want to do is I want to give you 5 anchors that you can drop to keep from drifting. Okay, 5 anchors that will help you to stay connected to each other and to keep drift from setting into your relationship. So here's the first one. The first anchor is this. Number 1, emotional connection. Emotional connection. This is what happens when love is being expressed and received in a relationship. But the flip side of emotional connection is not outbursts of anger. It's not resentment. It's actually just an absence of emotion. It's apathy. It's indifference. When you're emotionally connected, you feel loved. You're giving and receiving love with the other person. This is the reason that drift is such a dangerous thing. Most of the time, we don't even realize there's a disconnect happening. We're just not doing the things that we once did to express our love to our spouse in a way that they receive it, in a way that they feel loved. Now, all of us connect emotionally in different ways. That's why King David wrote this, and in the Psalms, he's writing kind of this journal. This is a prayer to God, and he says this. He says, "You made all the delicate inner parts of my body and knit me together in my mother's womb. Thank you for making me so wonderfully complex. Your workmanship is marvelous. How well I know it." That means we're all very complex, unique individuals, aren't we? And the truth is, because of that, we all connect emotionally in different ways. And this should be a pretty easy concept for us to understand. Because we know there are different languages spoken in different parts of the world. Mexico, they speak Spanish. Quebec, they speak French, right? Arkansas, they speak Redneck. So everybody speaks different languages. And so several years ago, probably 20 some years ago, Dr. Gary Chapman wrote a book called The 5 Love Languages. It's a massive bestseller. Many of you have maybe even read it, but this is such a great reminder for us. We speak different languages of love when it comes to our spouse. We're wired differently. And he says, here's kind of basically like 5 kind of dialects or languages that these fall into. One is physical touch. And some people, the way that they give and receive love is through physical touch. It's like, just like, a hug, a kiss, hand-holding, just all of those things. Snuggles, physical affection. It's just one of those ways that someone goes, man, I feel like my spouse really loves me when they hold my hand, when they rub my shoulder, right? When they sit next to me. It just makes me feel loved. Now, for other people, it's a different language. For other people, it's quality time. Now, every couple should spend time together, but for some people, it's like when we carve out that quality time, it's like that's what fills me up. That's what makes me feel like I'm loved. Another one would be giving gifts. Everybody enjoys giving gifts. Everybody enjoys receiving gifts, rather. But for that person who speaks that language, that little, like, hey, I saw this, and it made me think of you, and I got it for you, and it might be like $2. This isn't like elaborate gifts. This is just like the thought behind it that says, I thought of you. This particular thing made me think of you. That makes the person who speaks this language feel loved. Another one is acts of service, right? This is like doing things that you know your spouse would like you to do. Now, this does not include, like if you're like, hey babe, I picked up the laundry. That's called being a responsible adult. That's not a love language, right? This is like going above and beyond, like outside of the norm to do something that serves your spouse. And some people speak that language. And then there's words of affirmation. And so for some people, words of affirmation are that's the love language. It's like if you give them a compliment, if you affirm them, if you tell them that you love them, that you communicate it with words. Now, here's why this is so practical for us, okay? Because we all speak different languages, and the tendency is for me to speak my love language to my spouse, and then I'm shocked when it doesn't land. So I'm a words of affirmation. That's like my number one love language. And so when my wife says to me like, you are such a good man. I think that you're such a good dad. You're such a good husband. You are sexy. I'm like, all right. I'm like, dude, I can go all week on that. Like my love tank just fills right up. Now, I do the same thing to her. I'm like, hey, babe, I just want you to know how much I love you. She's like, thanks, love you too. I was expecting fireworks, and I don't know what happened there. Well, she speaks a different language than I do. But my tendency, because I'm a words guy, is to Oh, I'm gonna give her all my words. But what she is quality time. She loves quality time. And so what will make her feel loved is when I carve out quality time and I give her undivided attention. The thing is, we've got to work at learning the language of our spouse so that we can stay emotionally connected. Does this make sense? This is so intensely practical if you'll put this into practice. Work hard at understanding how your spouse connects emotionally, and it will help you to stay away from emotional drift. Emotional connection is an anchor that you can set that will help you communicate and receive love on a regular basis. Here's the second one, recreational connection. Recreational. This just means like hanging out with your best friend. It's like finding things to do together. It's enjoying an activity that you both like or that one of you is learning to enjoy because you want to spend time together. This is about building your friendship. Shanti Filton is a author. She's got a couple master's degrees in different fields of psychology. She surveyed over 1,000 couples. And here's what she discovered in interviewing all of these couples about what makes marriage, happy and thrive and flourish. She writes this is what the data says. 90% of the happiest couples say that spending time together is the biggest reason for their happiness. Doing home projects, taking evening walks, going to kids' sports, watching TV, or even going grocery shopping together. You're like, lame. Like, doesn't she mean like romantic cruises and like expensive dinners and getting all dressed up? No. It's not what you do that's important. It's that you're doing something together, that you're hanging out together, that you're finding things to do together. How are you doing at intentionally just being together? And it's about maybe even doing something that you wouldn't normally do, but it's something your spouse enjoys. So I'll go shopping with my wife, and she'll fill out a Final Four bracket with me. And why? Because I love shopping? No, but I'm a fan of her. So it's something we get to do together. Why? Because she just loves the Final Four? No, but she's a fan of me. So it's something we get to do together. Like, it's not about what you're doing, it's about doing something together. Again, in Ecclesiastes, this is King Solomon writing, and this is a journal of his life. And if you ever read Ecclesiastes, I'd encourage you. It's very depressing. You need read it with like a bottle of Prozac or something, right? Because in the beginning, he's like, life is meaningless, life sucks, life is terrible, it's all meaningless, chasing the wind. At the end, he's like, life is meaningless, it's all terrible, just trust God. But then there's like this one section in the middle, and in the middle, he's like, there is a bright spot though. And it's chapter 9. Here's chapter 9. He says this, relish life with the spouse you love each and every day of your precarious life. Each day is God's gift. He's like, man, you know what? Life is precarious. Each day is just a gift from God, so just enjoy it while you can. Enjoy life with your spouse. And if we're not intentional about this, we're going to spend our life doing things with other people, groups of friends, enjoying different hobbies, and we'll just drift and not even realize it. And we're not spending time with our spouse. Every couple is different, but if you can't point to something that you've done together in the last couple of weeks, it's possible you're drifting. It's possible. And if this is something you see unfolding in your own relationship, get out a calendar, put an X on a date, and plan to do something together. Your life is being spent together. And your time equals your life. So if you're not spending any time together, it's very possible that you're drifting. So recreational connection is an anchor that you can set that will help to keep drift from setting in. Here's the third one, intellectual connection. Intellectual connection. This is just about learning more about your spouse. This is about updating the database that you have about your spouse. This is really important. See, every time that you learn something new about your spouse, you are creating another data point that's actually an emotional connection. You're growing that emotional connection. And if we're not careful, all of our conversations begin to evolve around the same topics, right? Kids, money, job, and the busyness of like running a household and family. But intellectual connection requires some thinking. It includes exchanging ideas and thoughts about what you think about and what you care about. Dr. John Gottman is an author, wrote several books on marriage and kind of a marriage expert. He says, in marriage, people often change and forget to tell each other. Like, isn't that amazing? Like, there's things like when we first got married, I thought one way, and now I think differently, and there was never an announcement made. I never like woke my wife up one day and like, hey, good morning. I just wanted to let you know, I used to think this way, but my mind has changed. It's evolved over the last few years, and I just wanted to let you know, I think about it like this now. All right, have a great day. What happens? We just evolve as people, right? And over time, things shift and things change, and rarely do we announce it to each other. So all of a sudden, something comes up and there's a conflict and something happens, and you're like, I didn't know you thought about that. Like, what in the world? I thought we were on the same page here. It's so important for us to have intellectual connection. Let's be honest, when you first started dating, right? When we first started dating, our favorite TV show was ER, and we rented movies from Blockbuster and went home, put them in a VCR that we bought from Circuit City. None of that exists anymore. The world has changed, and your spouse has changed. So you gotta constantly update your mind with new information to help you stay intellectually connected. A great way to do that, Dr. John Gottman, you can just Google this, the love map. It provides questions for you to ask. I'd encourage you, put an X on the calendar and say, we're just gonna go out for coffee, we're gonna go out for dinner, or maybe we don't go out at all. We put the kids to bed and we sit down on the couch and we ask each other these questions. And they're questions that don't have to do with like, hey, did we get to this kid to the soccer field on time? And did we pay that bill? And did we sign this document and whatever? It's, I wanna know what you think about this. I want to talk to me about how you see the future and your hopes and your dreams. And sometimes those things change. Every single wedding that I officiate, I sit with the couple and I go, all right, you guys are about to exchange vows. But the vows that you're gonna make to each other are not just vows to the person standing in front of you. They are vows to the person each of you is becoming, because in a year from now, you'll be two totally different people. And 5 years from now, and 30 years from now. You're saying, I'm committing to the person you're becoming. That's so huge. So read a book together. Listen to a podcast together. Ask your spouse questions about things you know they're interested in. The healthiest marriages take time to communicate their lives together. And while every marriage is different, there are sometimes topics that are difficult to talk about. But when you're constantly updating your database about the person, it makes difficult conversations so much easier. And I know some of us are just wired in a way where we go, yeah, I just want to sweep it under the rug because I want to keep the peace. But can I just tell you something? If you don't develop a plan to communicate with each other, particularly when it comes to the most difficult topics, you might find yourself in a marriage that neither of you intended to build, constructed out of your own silence. That isn't what God wants for you. That's not what you want for each other. And so wisdom would suggest, okay, God, if you're the author of life, you've created us to connect on an intellectual level. Help us to do that. I love, again, the way that Solomon just adds wisdom to this. He says this, thoughtless words can wound as deeply as any sword. And we've all known that's true, that we can hurt our spouse more than anybody else can hurt our spouse with our own thoughtless words. But then he says this, wisely spoken words can heal. What if we were really intentional and took time to connect on an intellectual level with our spouse and learn about them as a person and they learn about us as a person? And that can set an anchor that can keep us from drifting. Again, in Proverbs, Solomon writes this, an honest answer is as pleasing as a kiss on the lips. Like, I want more of that kiss on the lips part. Then start doing the honest answer part. And you'll get more of the kiss on the lips part. Spend time learning about each other. And it will set an anchor that will keep you from drifting. Here's the fourth one. Physical connection. Physical connection. You're like, I've been waiting for this one. All right. Physical connection is more than just sex. Let's be clear. It's all about affection. It includes everything from hugging to hand-holding to kissing and cuddling, and yes, also includes sex. Okay. Physical connection implies touch. And touch can communicate acceptance and love. It's something that only the two of you share together. Now, this is really, really important, and we're gonna dive into something here over the next 5 minutes. It's gonna be really helpful for you. And if you have kids and you're like, oh, man, I didn't know we were gonna talk about this, we've got great kids programming. All right. The first century is very similar to the culture that you and I live in the Roman Empire. We live in a culture that says this, do whatever you want with your body, do whatever makes you happy in the moment, and who cares about the consequences? In fact, we've got all kinds of things going on in our culture that just say your body and your mind are separate. We've got all kinds of things going on in our culture that just go, hey, if your mind tells you one thing and separate from your body, just let your mind win and just change your body. And yet over and over again, the Apostle Paul would write, hey, submit your body to God and then he will renew your mind. That's what the scriptures teach. And if there's an author of life, wisdom would suggest that we go with the author of life, that God's God and I'm not, and that I submit my ways to his ways. So, having said all that, we actually live in a culture that's very similar to the first century Roman Empire. Do whatever you want to do with your body, it doesn't affect your mind, or vice versa. Live how you want to live, please yourself in the moment, because there's no consequences. And it's into that setting, and I think it's amazing how it's come full circle, and it really applies to us today as well. And into that dynamic, the Apostle Paul writes these words about married sexuality. This is what the Apostle Paul writes. He says, do not deprive each other of sexual relations, unless there's one reason to do that. You both agree to refrain from sexual intimacy for a limited time so you can give yourselves more completely to prayer. So, like, man, we just have not been having sex because we've been praying a lot. Most of the time, when I sit down with a married couple and this is a struggle for them, it's not because their prayer life is just crazy huge. We just can't find time to be with each other because we've been praying so much. There's other issues. And the Apostle Paul would say, look, this is an important dynamic, that this is a way to serve your spouse. This is not a way to get something for yourself. It's a way to serve your spouse. He would continue. He'd say, afterward, you should come together again so that Satan won't be able to tempt you because of your lack of self-control. He says, look, you don't deprive each other of sexual relations. It's something you give to your spouse as a gift. And there's a dynamic at play because the word Satan is actually the word for accuser, or the one who stands against. What happens if in a marriage relationship, you've said, I'm committed to this person. I'm in this covenant with you. I've taken vows that you are the one and only person that I'm going to be committed to, and I'm in this covenant. It's not a contract. It says I'm 100% for you, and you're 100% for me. And what happens if in that, I don't want to be exposed to you? It breeds insecurity. Because this sexual intimacy in a committed marriage relationship is a way for me to go, I'm 100% exposed, but I'm also 100% accepted. And when you do that with someone that you're in a covenant with, it creates an incredible amount of intimacy and trust and security. It's a way to serve your spouse. It's a way to renew the covenant that you made with one another. The promise, the vows that you took on your wedding day, you renew that covenant because it's a way to say, hey, on our wedding day, we committed that you're the one that I'm 100% committed to. And now, in the midst of you see me in all of me, 100% exposed, 100% accepted. And I do the same for you. And if you go too long without that in a marriage relationship, the Apostle Paul says the accuser can come in. You start to write a story in your own mind. The accuser comes in and starts to breed insecurity in your own mind. That's why the Apostle Paul encourages married couples to not withhold that from each other, but give that as a gift to your spouse. Because it helps build security. Having sex frequently when you're in a committed married relationship between a husband and a wife, it reunites you emotionally. It builds intimacy and trust in your relationship. It strengthens the bond that you share as you renew your commitment to each other. The actual amount of time varies from couple to couple. Right? Everybody's got different libido, but here's something that you both agree on. Nobody should feel sexually starved in the marriage relationship. And so you're like, I don't know what that is. I think being very serious, the most valuable, honest, vulnerable question you could ask your spouse would be, what does that look like for you? How can I serve you in this area? What can I do to please you in that part of our relationship? Now, some of you are like, so glad I came to church today. Let me tell you something else. This is the primary reason why sex outside of a committed marriage relationship between a man and a woman, sex outside of a committed marriage relationship between husband and wife, is so harmful. Our culture looks at that and goes, that's so archaic, and people who follow God's ways are so judgmental, and they're bigoted, and they have this one way, they're so narrow-minded, blah, 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 blah. Okay, great. Here's the reality. If God is the author of life, and God created life to be lived this way, and it creates absolute profound security in that relationship when you do it that way, and everything outside of that hurts you, what would you say to people you created if you were God? And you knew that outside of that committed marriage relationship between husband and wife, it would harm you. What would you say to you? You'd say, don't do it. Not because you're archaic and, narrow-minded and judgmental, but because you're so for people, the people you created and the people you love. And this is what God does. The reason sex outside of a committed marriage relationship between a man and a woman can be so harmful is because it's all about renewing the covenant that you made with your spouse on your wedding day. What happens when you enter into sexual intimacy but you have no covenant to renew? Now what you're doing is you're practicing renewing a covenant that doesn't exist. You don't have the commitment. You don't have the covenant relationship. And it does the exact opposite of its intended effect. It actually leads to a lot of insecurity. It leads to a lot of wondering. I'm 100% exposed, but I don't have the commitment of being 100% accepted. And now it actually leads to a lot of insecurity, a lot of hurt. It's why pornography is so damaging, because you can't enter into a covenant. There's no covenant there. It just leaves you feeling more hollow than ever before. There's no covenant to renew. And if you were God and you created people who you loved and you wanted to see their life flourish, what would you say to you? You'd say, do it this way. That sex is this incredible gift between a man and a wife, a husband and a wife. But outside of that, it can harm you, and this is why. See, without that covenant to renew, sex becomes consumptive. It becomes about what I can get out of it, not what I can give. In healthy married sexuality, it's this: I am giving something to my spouse. I'm giving them a gift. And if both spouses think about it that way, it's all about what can I give to my spouse that renews our covenant. If you take away the covenant, it is all about what can I get. It's all about taking and getting. And again, I know every couple is different, but if it's been a while since your kiss has been more than a peck on the cheek or held hands or done something special for your spouse or connected sexually, it's possible that you're drifting in this area. And the Apostle Paul would say, don't withhold that from each other. Give that to each other as a gift, because it helps renew the covenant that you have with one another. So physical connection will help you keep from drifting. Now, number 5, spiritual connection. Spiritual connection. As we continue to grow and become the people God's created us to be, it often highlights how many differences we have from each other. And one of our many differences we need to have in common is focus something that's a lot bigger than just, we like some of the same things or we both enjoy sports. Couples who make it across the finish line, it has less to do with compatibility. It has a lot more to do with something bigger than themselves that holds them together. Spiritual connection is about a shared faith. It's about finding ways to connect with God as a couple, and it will reinforce that your lives are moving in the same direction spiritually. And here's why this matters. What you believe about God will bleed its way into every part of your life. It's going to affect how you do parenting. It's going to affect how you manage your time, how you handle conflict. It's going to affect how you handle your resources. It's going to bleed its way into every aspect of your life. And if you never talk about God or what you believe spiritually, it's likely that you're drifting. Here's the good news. Over and over and over again throughout the scriptures, God promises if we will move in his direction, he's moving in ours. James, the brother of Jesus in the first century, would write this: come close to God and God will come close to you. That if you take a step in God's direction, he's moving in your direction. And if there's a constant underlying tension in your marriage because you're not on the same page spiritually, I would encourage you to have some really healthy, really tough conversations about how you're going to handle that, because it's pulling you in different directions. And if you really want to get on the same page spiritually, then I would encourage you, if you want to grow in your relationship with each other, start moving in God's direction, whatever that looks like. Take a step in God's direction. And here's what happens. If, as a husband, you start to move in God's direction, and as a wife, you start to move in God's direction, it's amazing how much closer you actually become to one another. It's this dynamic that God has created. And this can be so simple, okay? This does not mean that you have to wake up every morning at 5 a.m. and read 6 chapters of the Bible with a monocle in one eye, over tea, because that's when God likes to just spend time with us. It can be this simple. Hey, we're just going to commit as a married couple. We're going to attend church together. That's it. Start there. Hey, as a couple, we're going to go to a small group together. You know what? I'm going to take this next step, and I'm going to say yes to water baptism. I'm going to take a next step. I'm going to move in God's direction. We're just going to read one Bible verse together and pray together. And the prayer can be this, a one-sentence prayer. God, we're praying together today. Amen. If it's that simple, if that's what it takes to start there. It doesn't have to be elaborate, but start leaning in your relationship with God. And if you and your spouse both do that, you will be amazed at how much closer you grow to one another. Drift happens so slowly, most people fail to recognize it when it does. right? Because the distance creeps between them. But if you don't commit to setting some of these anchors, here's what's gonna happen. One day, you have kids, they're gonna leave the house. And what you will discover is that you were not friends and lovers for that entire time. You were business partners running a free bed and breakfast. And you don't want that. You don't want that to be the story of your marriage. It's never too late for a new marriage to the same spouse. But here's what I can tell you. You've got to start setting some of these anchors so that you don't drift further and further apart. Now, last thing, then we'll close. What comes naturally early must be intentional later. This was so easy when you were dating, right? It's like, no, everything just was so easy. And if we're honest, after we've been in a relationship for a while, we lose motivation to keep working on the relationship. It's so easy for us to take it for granted. Like when you got that new car, initially it's spotless, you're worried about any kind of little scratch on the outside. You're like, people get in, you're like, no food and drink allowed in my car. Fast forward 4 years, it looks like you're running a restaurant out of that thing, You put the window down, McDonald's is just wafting out of the... When Sherry and I were dating, I would ring the doorbell. And before I could even finish ringing the doorbell, the door would fling open like she was waiting for me, right there, And I'd be like, hey, when we were so excited to see each other, and I was wearing cologne, and I had the mixtape set to the perfect song. If you want to set anchors in your marriage to keep your relationship from drifting through the seasons of life, here's what it will require. Decision. You've got to decide to make it a priority. When you first met, it came naturally. Now it's got to be intentional. And here's our pushback to this. Well, that doesn't feel very romantic. Isn't it just supposed to be like chemistry? Chemistry is designed to bring us together. It is not designed to sustain us. Decision, this is true. Decision is a much stronger force than chemistry. This is true because you've changed diapers. Didn't come naturally. You weren't feeling it. But you're like, this has to get done because I love this little creature that we created. It's a sacrifice, but it's driven by love. That's love, right? And just because something happens naturally doesn't mean it's best for us or that it's more romantic. Many people built their marriage on chemistry only to discover chemistry was enough to start a marriage with. It is not enough to build a marriage on. The deepest form of love for someone else isn't doing what comes naturally. It's doing something out of decision. It's a much more powerful force than chemistry. It's saying, I'm going to sacrifice what I want in the moment for your long-term benefit because I am for you. It's setting aside what you may want to help somebody else. And when you make that decision over and over again, week in and week out, month in and month out, year in and year out, decade in, decade out, to sacrifice for your spouse, and your spouse does the same thing for you, it creates this incredible level of trust and intimacy. And let me tell you something, that's pretty romantic. Would you be willing to look at one of these areas this week? No matter where you find yourself in the marriage relationship, would you just be willing to say this? I'm going to look at one of these. Man, these are some anchors. Is there one anchor that I can put into practice that will help our marriage relationship this week? And then decide. I'm going to take a step in that direction. It's what God modeled for us. He sent Jesus into our world, not because it came naturally, but because God knew we needed Jesus. And then Jesus allowed himself to be put to death, not because that came naturally, but because Jesus wanted to put to death our sins and overcome death for you and I. And then he invites us to step into relationship with him. The author of life invites us to live life the way he designed for us to live so that we could flourish and thrive. If you've never said yes to that invitation, you don't have to behave your way in. It's just an acknowledgement. God, you're God and I'm not, and I want to say yes to your invitation to be a part of your family. If you've never said that, you can say yes by just agreeing with this prayer. God, please forgive my sins. Forgive me for the times I've walked away from you, and I am so grateful you never walk away from me. So God, I want to say yes to your invitation. Make me your son. Make me your daughter. And help me as I put my trust in you. Help me to trust you and follow you as best as I know how from this moment on. And God, for every one of us, regardless of our relational status, God, I just pray that you would help us to keep from drift. It's one of those things that can set in, and before we know it, we are somewhere we never wanted to be. But I pray that you would help us to set some anchors that keep us connected to each other and connected to you, because you want our marriages and our relationships to thrive and flourish. So help us to do that. We submit that to you in Jesus' name. Amen.